Good evening. Charles Darwin discovered natural selection, but he left out the cliffs of Chile. Isaac Newton gave us cause and effect, but he ignored electromagnetism. Karl Marx taught the Communist Manifesto, but he omitted revolution without the proletariat. And Sigmund Freud invented the Oedipus complex, but he forgot Prozac. That's all right. That was supposed to be a serious meeting. Geopolitical hypotheses, psychological models, scientific theories, all continuing attempts to explain ourselves to ourselves. In retrospect, each social or political or cultural hypothesis omits essentials that compromise its enduring accuracy. The question is, do these repeated failings invalidate the aspiration to conceptual modeling? Theorizing is an act of confidence in our potential to understand, in spite of a history of theoretical misunderstandings. So here's a hypothesis for what's architecture, and kindly let me know what I've left out. It's called the Iliad theory. So Odysseus joins the Trojan War and after 10 years attempts to return home to Ithaca. He bumps into Calypso and Poseidon and the Cyclops. The journey is interrupted over and over, but his intention never wavers. He knows where he's going, he knows why, a single mind and single-minded. Confident, consistent, secure in his destination, a beginning with a prescribed end, and the end will never be a new beginning. Let's call this the Oedipus, Let's call this the Odysseus postulate. Meanwhile, Odysseus' wife Penelope awaits his return to Ithaca. Suitors surround Penelope, anticipating a marriage opportunity. Years pass, and Penelope makes an agreement. She tells her suitors she'll select one of them as a husband when she finishes knitting a funeral shroud for Odysseus' father. That's a shroud she will never finish. Penelope knits the shroud during the day and takes it apart each night. Inconclusive in perpetuity, the end is no end. Every day, a new beginning. Let's call this the Penelope postulate. Empirically, most architectural lives are hybridized, chunks of Odysseus, portions of Penelope. Rarely do we see a pure rendition of either. Tonight, SCI-Arc has that opportunity, a precise line to an a priori goal, a consistent vision of design, cause, and effect, a rigorous integration of purpose and method, a systematized form language. Here comes Odysseus, here comes Todd Williams and Billie Tsien. A serious and committal body of work that from its earliest inklings has sustained its priorities, an insistent pursuit of a self-described adventure over self-described terrain. Work and rework, steady, patient, undeterred. Meanwhile, Penelope calls, Penelope emails, Penelope tweets, Penelope texts, Odysseus doesn't answer. Neither do Todd and Billie. Please welcome Todd Williams and Billie Tsien, recently returned from Troy, to SCI-Arc.
Well, that says it all.
So we are just going to talk for a little bit about really why we do things, because we wanted to talk about why we do things more than what we do, although of course we're going to show you what we do. So some of the things that we've come to understand that we believe in over time. First one is to be of use.
And actually, these are not things we felt from the beginning, but they're actually learned. So simultaneously, there are these goals, but also we learn more and more about ourselves and about the goals. So in fact, they are rather consistent. And the second is to move slowly. Years ago, we wrote an essay called Slowness and the value of drawing by hand and erasure by hand. Of course, we don't do that, but Billie and I still do that, but speed, the time moves very, very quickly, and it is moving ever faster. Yes, Penelope texts, but we continue to want to move slowly as we can.
The next one is to sometimes say no. Not all the time, but sometimes. I mean, Todd's always said to our students and to people, to younger architects, that an important lesson is to be able to say no. And it helps define who you are, because often it's very, very hard to know what it is that you want, and it's easier to understand what it is that you don't want.
So we define ourselves from both ends. And then to connect. Billie and I have discussed and fought on this one, but we want our work to connect. We want it to feel like it's actually part of the history of architecture and connective to the place where we're working, connective to the people for whom we're working, connective to, well, life around us.
But I also think that one can connect and also have a sense of identity as well. So it's not to blend and it's not to necessarily belong, but it's to connect. And then the final one is about trying to think about making work that lasts. And of course, a lot of times that's not within our abilities. It's not our decision, but it's always our intention. So we're just going to then talk about some issues that we continue to think about when we're working. And the first is the topography of the land. And it's both the natural topography and an artificial topography, creating a topography.
Well, I want to go back for a moment, because rather than to look, let's go back. I mean, I think that we have to recognize increasingly that the most important surface we have is that of Mother Earth. That is the intersection between sky and ground. And I think that at first, when you're working for up until the age of 40, I don't think we ever built anything, a freestanding building. It was all interiors. So we didn't really have an understanding, and I'd worked for Richard Meyer and thought of objects on the land. It was only later that I began to understand and realize that this surface is absolutely critical. And it's not only important to make those foundations true, but you also need to, in a way, embed yourself in the ground and grow from the ground. And we've actually been doing this now for more than 20 years. This is a project actually we visited yesterday, early hand-drawn section of what we thought the building should be. It wasn't quite this, but the rectangle that is there was the site we were given and the kind of building I think they expected us to modify. And this was down in La Jolla, not so far from the Salk Institute, the Neurosciences Institute, now 20 years old.
So the land sloped, so it had a natural topography, but we also cut the land to set the building down into the land.
And actually we invited this tunnel to go beneath North Torrey Pines Road to land on the top of our building. So you can see it's a deep excavation, and about 50% of the building is below grade.
So that tunnel actually opens, daylights onto what Todd is saying is the roof of that building. And then the ground floor of the building.
Actually, it comes through more or less here. and one walks along the roof and goes to other parts of the campus this way, but actually descends into this courtyard. And this is an auditorium, and these are laboratories that extend deep under the hillside, and then a large mechanical space below grade, and then a theory center here. So 3 parts, taking the program and pulling it into 3 parts and making actually the place in the land the heart of the building. So it's really the plaza.
So the place in between has a huge importance for us. The void is very, very important to us. It's as important as the solids. So these are early images of that sort of void space, but it's the void space that joins together the program, which has been broken apart. And then moving throughout the project, being on upper and lower levels, I think is also a very important part of that created the artificial topography.
Well, wherever we can, we try to remove elevators and escalators. We've never done an escalator. And to use your senses to move from one level of the land to the next, and actually then to embed yourself within the land.
The second issue that we think about is the presence of the human hand. And for us, that's always been tremendously important. As Todd said, we thought we were always going to draw by hand. We don't anymore in our studio, but we try to understand how it manifests itself in built work. So this was an image of the facade of the Folk Art Museum, and that was cast at an art foundry in upstate New York.
So here we were learning about the casting of the metal and open form cast. The building no longer exists, the panels are now in storage, but we wanted this building, which was folk art, to actually be about the person that makes it and about the differences in the quality of when things are handmade, hand-built.
Or here, a tile that we worked on with Heath Tile in San Francisco. And understanding that the body of the tile is dark, when you put a glaze on it, it pools and creates a kind of different densities, and then thinking about how if you actually made an impression in the tile, you could create a tile that had a sense of the hand, both actually literally physically, although in the end they tooled this depression, but also in the glaze.
Well, we were also happy that every single tile was a different tile. And so the texture was very, very rich. This is our friend Claudia Jongstra, who is a felt artist and lives in Friesland in northern Holland. And Claudia uses her own sheep, the wool from her own sheep, and she dyes the wool with the dyes from her own garden, or rather large gardens where she's growing herbs and flowers and then uses them.
And so this is a very large mural in a public space in New York City that is part of the complex of Lincoln Center. And then actually in our own apartment, this was a handrail that was drawn full scale by Todd, and then actually made by a blacksmith who sort of added his own interpretation based on really what was possible when you're bending a solid rod of iron.
But it's interesting that that corner actually is a reinforcing corner. It's also a good place to put your hand as you're turning the corner. So it strengthens.
Rethinking material. So this is a very old project. It was one that was done for the Walker Art Center, and Rick Gooding, who worked on this, is here in the audience, but it is looking at homosote and layering it and then slicing it and sanding it. So really rethinking the way, looking at a material and thinking about its sort of intrinsic qualities.
And this is snow. We worked with an artist, Karsten Haller, on a couple of snow sculptures. This one was actually a 6 foot deep depression in the land that was then filled with snow at the Arctic Circle. And so it became kind of a sculpture that you could only really experience by being inside it, going down the slide, going through the tunnel.
you would drop down through the small hole and come out at the bottom and then walk up those sort of slots in the snow. And then this is just looking at making our own veneer with a custom veneer company, and looking at this ash and deciding to use every single layer of the veneer so that they're very, very dark streaks, because usually that heartwood is thrown away. And then here at the East Asian Library at Berkeley, thinking about walk-off mats, because they're very, very cheap, and you can send a digital file and they'll print it on the mat. And so we took images from the Berkeley collection and then had very large walk-off mats made, and then they were mounted on the walls.
Yeah, they said in the library we couldn't have art, and we had no budget. So we just simply used their impressions and put the walk-off mats on the walls.
And then specificity to place.
This is also a very old project back in the 80s, a dormitory at Princeton, which is, and was supposed to be neo-Gothic reference, and you can see they're quite strong, maybe a little too postmodern, but the idea here was that it was rotated in the context of buildings that were done back in the 20s at Princeton. And in fact, it is a kind of tower, but I think one of the better things about it is the way it moves from one level to the next. And it's a solid building.
At the Phoenix Art Museum, it was really about trying to provide shade, and also a kind of veil of noise through the water that would create a separation from the Central Avenue, which was a very, very busy main street of Phoenix.
This is a recent project up in New Hampshire where we had to add to this very, very small one-room 1920s library, which had a fireplace in it, but which didn't make any sense with the books that were 100 years old, and no vestibule and no other place to work. So we basically took the fireplace and made it an element in the land, and then combined it with a very quiet, low building, so that it felt like, once again, well, you're making a place in the land, and then you're allowing the two different lives to come together.
So, I mean, I suppose in a way we were both trying to be a little bit more invisible. In New Hampshire, McDowell is an art and is an artist colony, but in the end, I think we couldn't help ourselves, and that big chimney moved outside.
So it's a place where people gather before they go into lectures in the wintertime.
And then finally, the primacy of the interior, because we really believe, and maybe it's as Todd said, because we started out all of our work in New York City, where for many, many years we only did interiors, but we know that most of our lives are lived inside, and so this sense of the importance of the interior is always a part of our work.
Actually, that's an interesting aspect of Eric's great work, which is that we think of them being these astonishing objects from the outside, but actually they're incredible interiors. This is a project in Michigan, an indoor swimming pool, which opens to the out of doors, and the roof opens, allows you to smell the pine forest that it's in. And the building is eventually being engulfed by the forest, so it really will be just an interior experience completely.
But in many ways, the power of the interior experience is really enhanced by the quietness of the exterior presence. So we would really like people to sort of walk in and, I guess, be amazed. This is a series of libraries that we did for the Robin Hood Foundation in public schools, and they're only interiors. So they're existing rooms in schools, and they were transformed into libraries. And here it was the ceiling, which was a very, very powerful element. You can see we think about the ceiling a lot from the Cranbrook project, and thinking about it as a sort of giant tree, but it's also the surface where we know we can control what happens on it.
So this was 3 smaller rooms that became a library, and this is 110th Street in Harlem, but now hardly Harlem anymore.
And this is the East Asian Library, and it is a very simple box, but it's a box inside that's cracked open by light. So we're going to show 4 projects today, fairly thoroughly. The first is the Barnes Foundation. The Barnes Foundation was a collection that was created by Albert Barnes and located really in a museum that was a house museum because it was part of his home in Lower Merion outside of
His wife was interested in
Philadelphia.
horticulture, and she they bought actually an arboretum. The house was in the arboretum. They removed the house and then had their foundation designed by Paul Kray, who was actually an interesting architect in the 20s, who was Lou Kahn's master.
So Barnes put together this collection, but he was very annoyed with the sort of intelligentsia or people who thought that they knew about art because they didn't appreciate his collection. So this is a letter that he wrote to Paul Kray where he's basically asking for an underground dungeon or a mitrailleuse, which is a machine gun, with which he could get rid of the people that he didn't like who would be coming to see his artwork. So it's always been a very idiosyncratic collection by a very
At the top of this
difficult
letter,
man.
you'll see him, he's complaining about Paul Kray's fees on a bookshelf or something like that. So he was the usual client, but he also wanted to gun down people who wouldn't appreciate his work.
Oops, sorry, going the wrong way.
So this was the building that Paul Kray designed and the collection and the way Dr. Brown's hung it. And you can see it's bilaterally symmetrical. He believed you didn't need to know about art to appreciate it. So there are names of the artists. In this case, there are a huge number of Renoirs. But you can see even within the bilateral symmetry of the main room, we have other symmetries. And he's using the hardware here to, in a way, have your eye traverse the entire ensemble, as he calls it, so you will see not only the works, but relationships between the works.
So the board decided to move it to downtown Philadelphia. Downtown Philadelphia has a very, very strong axis, which is the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. And at the end of the Benjamin Franklin Parkway is the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And then arrayed along that Franklin Parkway are a number of civic buildings. We came with an idea about this gallery, and we said if the original gallery is in a garden, then it would be good when you move to Philadelphia to try to bring that sense of serenity, the garden, into the gallery.
So actually, this was our interview model and our interview slide, which was a very small wooden model that we pulled apart and in which we inserted these green spaces, which were gardens, and then a light space, which was in a way light, to suggest that we would fill it with natural light. The collection in Marion was really, all of the windows had to be closed because there was no ability to bring natural light into the galleries there.
So one of the aspects of being able to move legally, because there are many legal challenges, was that the rooms, the ensembles, had to stay the same. So the ensembles had to stay the same, and the sequence of the galleries had to stay the same. So that was what the brown box was. It was really the galleries as they were. And because it was a neoclassical scheme, it was a symmetrical scheme. And when we looked at the plans that Kray did, we saw that there was essentially within those end galleries, you could cut them off, and that's where we inserted the green gardens.
Yeah, we recognized that all of these rooms needed to stay in sequence in exactly the same size as they were, but there were a couple of errors in the project. One is that this was a bearing wall and we could slide it out, and the other was that this was not an accessible entrance. So we were allowed to make very small changes, provided that they didn't affect the sequence or the ensemble. The site plan today.
And then this was a drawing by Laurie Olin, who was the landscape architect. But you can see that it is still a building that's set within an idea of a garden.
Right, we believe that everyone, instead of a car coming up to the building, you should leave the car at the curb and walk to the building. This actually was a big struggle with the board, but they eventually accepted that it would be good to have you walk through the garden in order to get to the building rather than bring a car right up to the building. And in fact, we walk up several different ways. This thing isn't really working. Yeah, it is. One walks up an incline of about 10 feet here, or gets dropped off here by a taxi, and then walks this way, and then enters what appears to be a small bridge, looks at water, and then turns right, and then turns left, and then enters into this very large room here. This is the collection, and we can see an inserted library and an inserted garden and a change actually to make it accessible.
And then sitting on top of the building, because you can see it's actually a very simple scheme, the gallery, an L-shaped space, the space in between, is a very large light box, and it brings light into the space in between and makes that space essentially a kind of garden.
And so natural light, as we had done at Berkeley, bounces around there. This is the light box on top. It's continuous PV panels, so this is
Hold it a little further away.
Okay.
You're echoing.
Okay.
And in many ways, this is the idea about connecting. So it's about connecting to what's there, but not necessarily being the same as what's there.
So in fact, all of the buildings on the Parkway are, the last of the buildings were done in the 20s. The earliest were done a little earlier than that. The Parkway really stopped development in the 20s, and so this is a really first new building on the Parkway, and we wanted it to feel like it connected to the old buildings.
So the gallery itself is in its form, with the exception of the insertions, the same as the original gallery, which means that the windows are essentially in the same places. So it still retains the sort of neoclassical proportions of Krays building. But we tried to create a much more contemporary sense of what the cladding was.
So in fact, the volumes are wrapped in stone, a kind of cloth of stone, and that cloth, not particularly here, wraps all of the buildings, the solid buildings, and creates a kind of fabric of stone. And that helps to break the idea of the symmetry. It also gives a sense of solidity which exists on the Parkway and with older buildings. And this is part of the idea of buildings being locked into the ground. We took it really, Dr. Barnes had a collection of African artifacts and fabrics, and we took it from the idea of the kente cloth here, which is that we could use, and we also then imagined as a rain screen that these margins between the blocks of stone could be a rain screen, so that you would play between these two, and slowly found the stone that we wanted, which came from Israel. It was at a cost we could afford, and it had a richness of texture that would work, and it was able to withstand the weather. So we always go to the quarries, and you learn from the quarry master where the best stone comes from, and you learn from that person where the best people to cut the stone are.
So one of the interesting things we had never planned on doing was to texture the stone, but when we were at the stone finishing facility, we saw that people were hand hammering the stone. So we decided that we would use that in various ways in the building. So that there's both a more free hammer that goes on, and then there's a kind of chisel which is more controlled, and then there's a low honed stone which is on the exterior. And
there's a sandblasted stone, and in a way it gives the stone more character. We can use more of it, and we also then worked with the sizes so that we could use the entire block. When you cut a block out, there are irregular pieces in the stone, like the ash. The core of the ash is dark, and we thought that variety of color was a positive thing to have, and it lowered the cost of the stone too. The entrance. A detail of another detail that we added. This is a mosaic on the floor that Billie drew, taken from what is called a liar's cloth,
which is a traditional African weaving pattern. So the interior, the light always shifts and changes. This is a space in between the sort of service L-shaped building and the gallery building. And we see this as a garden, and it's a very serene space. We worked with Paul Morantz to figure out the optics so that the light comes in, but you never see the sky. And then that actually that section flips and it extends and cantilevers out the back of the building, and it provides shelter for an outdoor space.
So this is one of the few museums where you can be in the museum or in the galleries and step directly to the out of doors.
There's a changing exhibition gallery that is part of the new program. And then one of the very, very interesting things about his collection is that he seriously collected African art, not as a kind of anthropological study, but considering it as art. And so there are many things in the sort of details that we thought about which had to do with thinking about essentially kind of African art. And these are coming from an African motif, and they're the bronze doors that close off the gallery space.
So the galleries today look exactly like the galleries did before, or people think they do. Certainly the paintings are exactly the same position within about an 1/8 or a 1/16 of an inch relative to the windows, the jambs, the baseboard and all. But actually everything has changed in there, including the lighting, which is now hidden, although we have the placebo of the light that once hung in the gallery. Then we mocked up full-scale galleries so we could test some of these ideas. Not only the making of the woodwork and transforming a detail of wood making that we didn't know about, neoclassical detailing of Paul Kray, to something that was a little bit more contemporary.
But we were moving back and forth because as people who were not familiar with this idea of really sort of these baseboards and cove moldings, I mean, totally unfamiliar, we first stripped everything down. And then the work itself looked as if it had no sort of grounding, so the paintings seemed to float. So we understood that we needed to add back in a kind of level of detail that would give the work itself, the paintings, their sort of horizon, their gravity and their sky.
So one of the tough things was to connect our more contemporary work with the traditional galleries. And this actually here, we're trying to play it as straight as possible. On your left is the newer gallery, and on the right is the old gallery. Everyone said the galleries are exactly as they were before, but actually there were metal windows, and you couldn't see out of the windows, and they were painted white. But the dimensions are basically there.
And then we also added these skylights to the top floor galleries, which never had
Or clear stories.
kind of natural light. And then this is an image from that garden space that we inserted. So it's actually a sunken courtyard that brings light all the way through and carries it all the way down to its lowest level.
So this is 20 feet below grade, where we have a garden that you can step into in the library, an auditorium, classrooms, bathrooms, shop. And this is the loading dock end of the building.
So the second project is in Hong Kong. We actually don't do very much work outside of the country, but this is an American client, and it was actually the Asia Society, which started in New York by the Rockefeller family to help the Western world understand the Eastern world. So I think
this was a competition won in 2001, actually, on September 11th. So it was a bittersweet project. This is the site. It's actually really embedded in the sort of mid-levels of Hong Kong, and it's here where the British had made
a munitions factory.
A munitions factory back in the 1800s. This building comes from the 30s. This is the way we saw it in the 2001 during the competition. We wanted to. We were required to save 3 of the buildings. We decided to save 4 of them, and then also to save the landscape.
So the sections just show what the British did because it was a slope. They cut it and they made it flat. They put these munitions buildings on it.
This is the flat section right here that they had cut into this slope. So we continued that. We made that the primary datum of our project, and that becomes the rooftop of our building, which is here.
So those of you who know Hong Kong know it's a very vertical city, and so we decided to make a horizontal building. in the vertical city. So it's very much about horizontality. The pink buildings are the heritage buildings. And it's a site that's divided in half by a water channel called a nullah. The high side of the site has the 3 buildings, and the low side of the site has that one C-shaped building. And our building is really the yellow building and the bridge that connects the upper and lower site. And we restored the existing buildings. But one of the interesting things about the site is that there are 2 big berms, and the berms are constructed berms, and they're there to prevent, because they stored powder, if one of the buildings blew up, the berm is there to prevent the other buildings from catching fire and
So they're
up.
taller than this space here, and about the same width. So this is our building as viewed from one of the towers nearby, now complete, and the rooftop, one drives up, can only drive this far into the site, gets dropped off, this is the British consulate, gets dropped off here and enters the building and then ascends to the roof and walks between the buildings. There are 2 paths, one is the one at the rooftop and the other one is one that parallels that below.
So it's a very steeply sloping site, and this is our new building, which sits behind a building from the 30s.
The 30s building restored, and we've enclosed the kind of porch of that building where we drop off, people are dropped off, and you walk around this wall and you get a hint of a space through this slot here. And otherwise it's a very quiet, sorry about that, a very quiet site. You can hear the bustle of the city here, but when you go onto the other side of that wall, you're in the jungle.
And so that slot that Todd spoke about is the slot that you see in the green wall, and that's where you see the water coming down from a pool which is above.
And not only is the pool on the roof above, it falls into this pond, but the nullah then actually runs beneath you. So you're really in at the sound of the jungle.
So this is taking you from the lower level up to the roof level. Here's the pool that's dropping the water down, but it's really just a horizontal plane that is the primary face of the building.
So this is a bridge we had to make that would avoid certain trees and would carry the services between one level and another. They're actually accessed from the upper level, so you remove pavers and then can get to them, but that allows the upper level to be serviced from the lower level. It also allows someone to walk in the case of the monsoon rains or the hot sun and humid sun in shade and separated from the heat and the rain.
So our building is actually, that you see, is a very sort of transparent building. But when you get to the top, there are the restored buildings, the berms, and then this canopy that we made, which is also referring back to the kind of canopies that you see in Chinese gardens. And on the ground, you can see the tracks that are restored because they would put the munitions into small carts, and then the carts would run along the tracks, and then they would go down, be cabled down to the war boats that were waiting in the harbor.
So the columns are both also drains from the roof. The restored buildings. One of the munitions buildings turned into a museum, and you can see the berm on the right that was restored. Actually, when they first made these berms, there were no trees on them, but the trees have grown up as volunteers, and now they're listed, so they have to remain. Here we're on the interior of one of the munitions buildings, where the walls are granite walls that are 6 and 8 feet thick.
We did cut through one of the berms to make a passageway through the site a little bit easier. And so this is taking you through a cut that we made in that big berm. And then the farthest building, which has been made into a small theater. And then looking back away from the city to the mountains.
And now back to the city.
So this is the third of the 4 projects. This one is in India, and we've been working on this project for
13 or 14 years. Well, not as long as Eric, but at any rate, this came to us, and we were astonished that someone would want us to work in India. they said that they wanted to do basically a corporate campus for writing software. Actually, here we are actually on the campus in some ways, and also looking at these incredible stepwells that exist, and women and the crafts that we can get in India. So we were really excited when we said, why did you choose us? They said, well, we think you appreciate the crafts, and crafts are one of the great things we've got here. And we also think you will respect the land. And we have these amazing trees here. And then finally, they said you don't have a signature, and you'll think about your signature, your building feeling like it belongs here. And that seemed like a pretty good beginning.
So the site is along the the north-south highway, and it's very near the airport. It's in Mumbai, and was the site, I think, of a former factory. And so it's very treed. And this was an early sketch about buildings that finger out into the land, because the land is sort of rising at the far end of the fingers. And a kind of the service buildings and a sort of barrier between the highway that goes.
Well, we had a couple of principles here. One is that we would air condition as little as possible, and that there would be no cars that would be on the site. That we put all of the cars in a sub-level basement, which has natural light, 600 cars. We're very close to the sea level, so that dewatering was terribly important. This is a model, an early model of that, and then a later model. Presently, we've got about 2/3 of this made. There are 2,000 people working on the site. This section of the site is done, although we haven't been there now for a year, and the landscaping is still done. The third finger is being done and will be completed this year, and a fourth element will come in hopefully shortly after that, the conference center.
So it's the purple and yellow that are still to come, pink that's done.
Oh, thank you.
And then the Google image of the part that's been built so far. We tried to use really Indian material. So this is a stone that comes from the south of India. And then we also made canopies using China tile, which is a very traditional way of shedding water. So this is the protection. It's used on the underside and it's used on the top.
So when you get out of a car, you're under this canopy, or that it allows you to be in shade wherever you go in between the buildings, and also gives you an introduction to the site. The women putting the China tile, actually it's a belt and suspenders operation, because we actually have a membrane and then a concrete, kind of soft concrete level on which they're putting the China tile as a kind of an additional barrier.
It's really interesting though, because the crafts are really divided by villages. So this is women from a particular village that come for a certain amount of time. And so they sit, it's very communal, and they are tiling around where they sit, and then they join them together. So after they go, you look at it and you can see really where each person sat, because there's a kind of shadow of their where the reach of their hand.
We tried to keep the trees on the same plane as they were, but we drove the buildings horizontally into the land. So there's a 30-foot shift from one level of the site to the other, and then worked on the landscape here. I guess this is our own design. Basalt walls contain those trees and allow you to walk in these gardens. This will actually already is now absolutely green, I'm told.
Actually, I think it has a lot to do also with looking at the stuff in Hong Kong, the berms.
Yeah, well, there you go.
So this is an elevated walkway that lets you walk from one building to another. And here we're looking at jollies, because people are still carving them, both hand carving them and then water jet cutting them.
But these are pretty cool, because they're 3 feet and they're carved on both sides, and they're 7 feet tall. And so they are supported by the railing here, and there are 2 pieces that then constitute the walkway. And that also, of course, protects you, but it's clearly a Mughal influence, the idea of kind of veil looking out at the landscape. This idea of withholding is something that's often in our work.
So this section just shows that the buildings, the land is rising up, contained in berms, and the buildings are staying flat, so that we're trying to shade the windows by the presence of the land, the solidified presence of the land.
This was a tough one for them because they could have built 5-story buildings here. We thought that the buildings should be lower than the trees. And so we used these retaining walls, which are to hold the trees and so you actually walk through rooms in the landscape that are formed by the retaining walls. Some of them are quite tall.
So the white spaces are conditioned. The social spaces, which are also the circulation spaces, are outdoors and under cover and not conditioned.
And all fire stairs are exterior and are concrete and stone. And then we made the walkways. We used wood from the old go-downs and then made the walkways social spaces. So you're only working in an air-conditioned space and you step outside to read the paper or take your tiffin, play ping pong, or meet a friend.
And the workspaces themselves are configured around an interior courtyard, and that courtyard has a cover, but it has an oculus in it. So we're trying to bring in natural light so that you have natural light when you're working, but not so much so that you're pulling down the shades.
Well, at that latitude, the sun is very, very vertical. So these torqued oculi stop really the sun from coming deep down into the space, and it moves. And thus, people working in the workspaces don't need any shades. They have large glass windows to look into this interior world.
So these are part of a women's collective, and they're weaving at home based on designs that we sent them, which were also based on a traditional ikat pattern, but very, very large. So they're part of the sort of interior.
Yeah, there are 115 different ikats that were created. Ken, you can almost see the movement of the women's hands here on these walls. And this is a ridiculous thing we did, which was to make a gymnasium. We suggested every great corporate campus should have a swimming pool and a gymnasium. And this is poured in place concrete so that the water thunders through the center there in a monsoon.
This is the final project we're showing tonight. It's an ice skating rink in Prospect Park. And for us, it's very, very important because it is, I think, our most public project, and it's
it's
in
for the
that
public.
way, yeah.
It's fantastic. This isn't exactly to scale, but it shows Central Park and Prospect Park. Prospect Park's a little smaller than Central Park and was done 10 years after it by Olmsted and Vox.
It's bigger.
Prospect Park is smaller than Central Park. Read the numbers. Central Park is bigger. I'm bigger than you are.
Okay.
About the same scale.
Okay, all right.
Okay, got it, okay. At any rate,
This is what happens in the office.
yeah, okay. Sorry, bit of an asshole. So actually, when Olmsted and Vox did this portion, they thought this was better. It's hard to say it's better. There's a 1.25 mile meadow, there's a heavier forest, and there's a larger artificial lake. And in this portion of the lake, they always saw this as sort of populous end of the lake, and where people would skate and the people would come together.
So this is actually from their original drawings. And so there was a carriage concourse where the carriages would turn around. There was something called Music Island where they thought people would perform music and people would sit at the concert grove and watch the musicians play on Music Island. But in the 60s, during the Moses years, they filled in the water around Music Island and put an artificial ice skating rink. And then they took the carriage concourse and put asphalt on it, and it became a huge, huge parking lot.
So our assignment actually was to make an indoor rink in the park, and we suggested that wouldn't be a good thing. In fact, we were supposed to make 2 rinks because people did love these rinks, but they were in terrible, this rink, one rink, but it was in very poor shape. And really, except for its use in 3 months in the winter, the place was desolate.
So this is a model of our first idea, which
This is, oh yeah, there it is over there. It's really way too grand, but
It was way too expensive.
and way too expensive. But the idea was that we would change restore Music Island, restore the Edge, Concert Grove, and build a 30-foot high mound that would enable us to cover with deep foliage one of the rinks, and then to have another rink. In the end, we had to redesign
Yeah, so you can see we went from that
to something.
to that.
So
Which is much
basically,
simpler.
it's two rinks. Well, it saved half the budget. This is a size of the former Boston Garden. It's a hockey rink with a green roof. There's a 30,000 square foot building underneath the ground. And then this is an oval rink. And from time to time, these are connected. And in the summer, this becomes water play. And all of this has then been restored. What's kind of cool is you walk up and actually don't realize that you're on top of the building. The buildings really have a very, very quiet presence. That is the exception of the canopy.
So here's the new rink. It's actually sitting on top of what was the carriage turnaround, which became the parking lot.
So 300 cars are gone from the park, and this new facility is there. This was it last winter, just after it was finished. You can see the oval rink, sometimes connected to the hockey rink, this green roof over this canopy, which has asymmetrical columns that support it. And then the facilities, I mean, you need a restaurant or cafe and rental rooms, and you need a place for the Zamboni and the mechanical, and you need park rooms for people. And in fact, this one facility doubles the toilets that exist in the park. So quite a few things go on here. The restored edge of the island.
I mean, I think it was a big responsibility to do something in an Olmsted and Vox Park because it's a new building. And it was actually a very large presence, and so we worked very hard to suppress it in many ways, like at Cranbrook, where you have the Saarinen building. So you're trying to sort of be quiet, but at the same time, you're trying to provide some sense of amazement. So we were going back and thinking about, once again, like at the Robin Hood libraries or at Cranbrook, what can you do, what can you control, and you can control the ceiling.
This tree was planted by Olmsted and Vox, so it's a 150-year-old tree at this point. The buildings are granite, that they are recessive. This is, I don't know when that was shot. We thought we would get schist from New York because they're making this huge tunnel, but they're grinding that up very, very small, and in the end we went to Canada to get this, and it's stone that is chopped, so it's a very, very crude way of cutting the stone, and it makes it quite inexpensive. But it enables you to get these very large and rough blocks that are more similar to the way the parks were made.
So this is a retaining wall that's holding the earth that eventually covers some of the building program. And it's really the entry as you sort of walk in, so you don't have a sense that the building is there. And then as you get closer, you buy tickets.
Well, the only thing you buy tickets for is being on the ice. Right. Otherwise, it's completely open and free throughout the year. Here's a tile wall. These marks in the ceiling are actually just paint cut into an ephes ceiling, which is kind of a creepy material. But that is a cut in the ceiling that then we put silver paint in, so it's actually the reflection from the light off the ice. That creates these marks, maybe skaters' marks.
So you can
figures.
skate back and forth if there's no hockey game. And now curling, who knew, is a very big thing in Brooklyn. So they have curling there. But when that's not happening, then you can skate in a channel back and forth between the hockey rink and the other rink.
We put in the mechanical space because actually every part of the building should be built well. And we care. A little cafe. Roller skating in the summertime, and water play in the summertime. Kind of a thin skim of water goes over this oval space. So really this last summer was the first, it's just now had 1 year in use, but it's made a great improvement. Here we are seeing people skating between the two rinks. In fact, this gives the largest artificial ice in North America, supposedly, when you can connect the two. And then you also are just slightly high enough so that you can look out onto the frozen lake, which they don't allow people to skate on anymore.
So it's really the end of our lecture. I have to say that in many ways coming to SCI-Arc, because we realized we taught here, we were trying to figure out when we taught.
Close to 30 years ago.
Here. What? There you go.
87. We have some incredible students here.
And we feel, I don't know, it's just, we feel very, very connected to the sort of spirit of this place. Even, of course, as it changes, grows, moves to another place. So it's a wonderful feeling to come back, to be invited back. So we thank you for inviting us. We really do believe that as architects, we are all optimists. And so it's very much part of our core belief.
Thank you.